Hello, my name is Ashley, and I'm actually re-recording a recent study we had on Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving is one of those holidays that is near and dear to us as Americans, but sometimes what we think about Thanksgiving isn't what actually happened on that day. So we want to go back about 400 years and look at the real history of Thanksgiving and what it means today for us as Christians. Tonight's agenda will briefly look at why was Thanksgiving so important, particularly to Bible prophecy? What was it like to live like back then? Who were these pilgrims? How did they set the stage for the democracy that we experience today? What was their experience like? And what were some specific miracles that God performed on their behalf? Lastly, we want to take all that and apply it to our lives today. A lot of people are familiar with the year 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, but they may not realize that many people, many Jews and Christian historians, believe that this was the perfect timing. Because in 1517, Martin Luther started the Protestant Reformation, where millions of people would be looking for a place to survive. Christopher Columbus was not the first to discover America, but he made it a permanent settlement. He opened it up for the rest of the world. There were many native tribes here, but disease had decimated about 90% of them prior to this. So there truly was a lot of land where nobody was living on. The Protestants needed a place to survive. They needed a place where they could practice freely. And just 25 years later, they were able to come to America and they were able to establish a democracy, a place where each person was valued, a place where their vote actually counted, and a place where they could worship freely. None of this could have taken place if Christopher Columbus wouldn't have actually discovered America just 25 years earlier. A lot of people believe that this actually fulfills the Bible prophecy of Revelation 13 that says, at the end of the papal oppression, the 1,260 years of oppression, all of a sudden something would rise up out of the sea, an uninhabited land. It's described as a lamb with two horns. A lamb is peaceful, giving freedom to all. The two horns, many people believe, are the civil or the religious liberties that America offers. So not only is this providential, but it very possibly could fulfill the prophecy of Revelation 13 as well, that America was raised up at just the right time. And the Pilgrims, contrary to what a lot of people think, were not the first Protestants here in America. About 80 years earlier, there was a group of French Huguenots here in Florida. They established Fort Caroline in northern Florida around Tallahassee, but unfortunately, they were actually massacred by the Spanish. The Spanish set up a rival fort called St. Augustine, which we're very familiar with, and they wanted to annihilate the Huguenots. They hated them in Europe and they hated them here in America. So, unfortunately, this massacre of Fort Caroline occurred where most of them were killed, and those that were survived were actually sold into slavery. And this is a very tragic period in Florida history. If the Huguenots would have established Florida instead of the Spanish, who knows? Maybe things would have turned out a lot differently. Later on, Spain was sold to America. It did get grafted into this Protestant nation, but for many, many years, it was actually Catholic. And in order to settle in Florida, you actually had to take an oath of loyalty to the Catholic Church. So Florida was not always the state of religious liberty that we associate it with today. Fort Caroline, St. Augustine, there was Roanoke, there was a few other attempts at settlement here in America, but the one that is near and dear to us as Americans is the settlement at Plymouth Colony. If we look at these pilgrims who established Plymouth Plantation or Plymouth Colony, they did not have an easy life. They originated in England and they were actually breaking away from the Church of England. The Church of England was very similar to the Catholic Church, except that you could actually get a divorce, and the head of the church was the king instead of the Pope. But you pretty much could only use the approved prayer book or Bible that the church wanted you to. And if you dared to preach in any place without a credential or without a license, you could actually be jailed. And there was a lot of people who wanted to purify the church and get it back to its apostolic roots, but they were being persecuted for doing that. There were some people that were so radical that were saying, hey, the church is past purification. We need to totally separate. And they were called the separatists. The Pilgrims were actually separatists. They didn't even think you could purify the church. They just totally wanted to set up their own church. And they were getting chased out of the country. So before they went to America, they settled in the Netherlands for a few years. And yes, they actually experienced great religious freedom there. However, with religious freedom, there is the downside that your children may choose not to follow Jesus. And many of their children married non-believers. Many of them left the church. And the Pilgrims actually started looking back on England with fondness because when they were being persecuted, their families were faithful. But in this time of prosperity and religious freedom, their families were falling apart. So they returned to England with the intention of actually sailing to America. After multiple attempts and many times of being taken advantage of, they were able to purchase the Mayflower, and in 1620, about 102 passengers set out for America. Half of them were separatists, and the other half were adventurers, laborers, or people that just wanted to get out of England. And as they sailed across the Atlantic, it was in around October, November-ish. It was a cold time, but it was bearable. But when they got to America, a lot of historians believe that we were going through a mini ice age at that time. It was so cold, they actually couldn't get off the ship. They actually had to just get off the ship in these small little boats. Only a few men would go and they would like forage for food, and there was nothing because it was winter. And they would explore the area and then they'd get back on the ship. And for several weeks, the women and children could not get off the ship at all just because of how difficult the weather was. And it was quite depressing, very dark, very dismal, very cold. One of the leaders, his wife slipped off the ship and she died. Some people think it was suicide, some think it was an accident, but it was very tragic for everyone involved. Before they finally got off the ship in November, they made the adult men sign the Mayflower Compact. And this is just a short document that basically said, we are now out of the jurisdiction of England. They were supposed to join up with the settlers in Jamestown. A storm blew them about 300 to 400 miles off course, so they were in uncharted territory. And they said, before we get off, you have to sign this that says you will be loyal to God, you will be loyal to the king, which is ironic because they were running away from him, but they still respected him. And they said, you will obey these rules. So to get off, you had to sign it. And a lot of people think this was one of the first steps toward democracy in America. The Pilgrims did not necessarily practice democracy at first, but this is one of the things that led to it. This Mayflower Compact, which actually you can still see today, was so important because it showed the state of their heart, that although they were being persecuted by King James, they were actually still loyal to him. They didn't want a state of anarchy. They didn't want him to think that they were disobeying his permission to settle in Virginia. They were settling in Massachusetts because they were blown off course and they had to get off the ship. They agreed that they would enact laws, ordinances, constitutions, and offices for the good of the colony, and that everybody would obey these laws. They agreed they would work together, and they agreed they would live in accordance with the Christian faith. You could see now they were quite a distance away from England, and although they were supposed to be down in the Virginia colony, they were significantly farther north, and they called it Plymouth Colony or Plymouth Plantation. And what made this so exceptional is the Jamestown settlers did not have such a positive experience. 50% of them died. A lot of them did not want to work. They came here for gold and they came here for glory. A lot of them killed each other through duels. My husband and I have been to the museums and the settlements there. There was instances of cannibalism. You could actually see the skeletons of people within the museum, and people have like basically burrowed into their brain matter to try to get that brain marrow because they were so low on fat. And there's instances of a man, he was actually burned at the stake for killing his pregnant wife and trying to eat her. So sometimes when we talk about Jamestown, it's with like nostalgia, like look where we came from, look at this first great settlement. But Jamestown was an utter failure. People did not want to work. They introduced slavery and tobacco fairly early. There was a very strict hierarchy, so most people were poor, and there was an oligarchy that made all the decisions. They resorted to cannibalism, and if the Pilgrims would have joined up with them, just like what had happened in the Netherlands, their faith would have been greatly polluted, and they probably wouldn't have stood out like a city on a hill like they did in Massachusetts. So when we look back on who truly made America what it was, Jamestown gradually got better. However, it was really these pilgrims at Plymouth Plantation, they are what made America exceptional. They led the foundation, they built the foundation for a Protestant heritage that was independent of the Catholic Church. The Pope did not rule here in North America. They valued liberty and protection of individual rights. Before you got off the ship, you actually had to sign the Mayflower Compact that you entered into a covenant with God, the King, and each other, and that you would obey the rules. And they took their concepts of freedom and division of power from scripture. Not one person had all the power. You could vote for your leaders, and you could also vote to remove them. They believed that everybody was equal in the sight of the law. Now, for a few years, slavery did exist in New England, but fairly quickly they were convicted of its sinfulness. And they also realized that you really can't prosper under a slave-owning society. It really stunts creativity. No one wants to work. And it actually not only is a curse on the slave, but it's a curse on the master as well. So, within a few years, slavery was pretty much unknown in these northern colonies, and everybody was valued. Now, granted, blacks, women, those that were of a different faith, they did not receive their rights until later on, but at least it was the springboard. It was the starting point for other people to receive those rights. A lot of people sometimes think that America is a country just like anyone else, but I encourage you to go to Revelation 13. See how America was raised up at just the right time as a beacon of religious liberty to the rest of the world. Look at all the things that America has done. World War I would have turned out differently if the Americans hadn't assisted the Allies. World War II, who knows? The Japanese and the Nazis would probably have dominated the world if America hadn't gotten involved. I know that there's a lot of controversial views in regards to the Cold War, Vietnam, Korea, but I truly believe that America stopped the halt of or stopped or halted communism. Imagine what this world would be like if communism was the dominant worldview. It still does exist, but it's only in 5 countries, not 500, thanks to America. So America truly is exceptional, and it was raised up at just the right time. Now, everything wasn't beautiful and perfect for those pilgrims. When they got off the ship with around 102 passengers, by the next spring, only 50% of them were still alive. They cite that as many as 45 died, and in some periods, it was actually 2 or 3 people a day that were dying. Out of the 18 wives on the Mayflower, only 5 of them survived by that spring. And it wasn't uncommon for a husband to lose his wife or a wife to lose her husband, and within 2 weeks, they were married to someone else. Time was very difficult back then. Children needed to be cared for, families needed to be raised up. So grieving did occur, but it was a lot quicker than it would have been today. When we look at why did they die, well, the Mayflower was actually an old leaky ship and it had transported alcohol, particularly wine, prior to this, and it also transported horses. So for months, as you're crossing the Atlantic, you're smelling, old wine, which we all know smells like vomit. You're smelling manure. You're cramped, most likely on the second or third deck because the weather is so cold outside. You are not getting a lot of fresh fruit and vegetables. So as a result, your teeth may be falling out. You're probably getting scurvy or pneumonia. You're surrounded by human waste or animal waste. Depression, anxiety, just the state of one's mind. You're not getting a lot of fat. You're not getting a lot of vitamins and minerals and vitamin D. Their diet itself was very high in salt because they had to eat a lot of preserved food. They didn't have proper nutrients, which weakened their immune system. And in a lot of cases, they simply did not have enough food. That first winter, there's that legend of the 5 kernels of corn, where for some days, that's all they had to eat was 5 kernels of corn. But they did make it on land. However, although they were surrounded by water, they didn't really know how to fish. These were factory workers, these were craftsmen, these were pastors. It was cold, it was rainy, it was snowy, it was dismal, the ground was frozen. It wasn't really until Squanto and Samoset assisted them and taught them how to farm and how to fish that they truly began to thrive. And a lot of people, not just Adventists such as myself, but I actually got a lot of this information from library books. There's a lot of Jewish historians and there's a lot of Christian historians that believe that there was a series of miracles that show that God was smiling upon the American experience. This wasn't just a group of people that happened to survive. God preserved them for a reason. And you can actually check out this book at the library. It's called Michael Medved's The American Miracle. He's been featured multiple times on Fox News. But according to historical research and just even a basic textbook that you can read in any given school, the Pilgrims were actually supposed to join up with the Jamestown settlers, but storms and conditions forced them off course about 300 to 400 miles away. So they were able to form their own government completely independent of the Church of England and completely independent of what was going on in Jamestown. Now, when they got off in Plymouth, Massachusetts, the spot had actually been cleared. The land itself was cleared and it was ready for settlement, but about 90% of the Indians had actually died from a variety of diseases that had been spread by sailors. Now, there's a lot of historical revisionists that will say, oh, this was done on purpose. But germ theory didn't really come out until the 1800s. This was in the 15 and 1600s. People didn't really know what caused disease. So, yes, horrible things were done to the Indians, but at that time, people were not purposely infecting them with disease because they didn't even know that you could do that. This was back then where you didn't necessarily wash your hands. You maybe bathed once a week. You shared utensils. You didn't really know what caused disease. When someone was sick, you would bloodlet them. You would cut them and let them bleed the bad blood out. There was all kinds of things that people would do. They didn't necessarily know how disease was spread. So it simply is not true that people were spreading disease to the Indians in the 15 and 1600s. But unfortunately, many Indians had died because they hadn't had immunities to the diseases that the sailors had been exposed to. So in this particular area, there was not a lot of Indians and there was a lot of land for settlement. And something that's worth noting is the early separatists or pilgrims did pay the Indians for their land. Now, later people that immigrated to America did not. They often took it by force. But the pilgrims were actually so conscious of what it meant to steal and of what it meant to kill that one time they were foraging for food, they found a grave and they actually found some dried corn in the grave and they took it back to feed their families on the ship. But then their conscience smote them. They felt really bad. Like, what do we do? Even though it was in the ground, like that's actually stealing. So they went back and they actually put some of their things in there to try to make up for what they had stolen. Later on, with the assistance of Squanto and Samoset, they were able to actually form some relations with the Indians. The Wampawag Indians and them became allies, and for 40 years there was no fighting between them. Now, the Wampawag did have some enemies, and because the Pilgrims had entered into, you know, a state of allyship with them, they did need to fight the Wampawag enemies. But they weren't this violent, bloodthirsty group of people that sometimes people associate them with. As much as possible, they tried to live at peace with their neighbors. They actually did send missionaries to them. Some of the Indians didn't have a written language, so these men were very dedicated in learning the language and actually creating a written language and translating the Bible from Latin or Greek into the Indian language. So, yes, this land was uninhabited in some areas, but these pilgrims in particular, they tried to do the right thing. If there was Indians in the area, they tried to form friendships with them. They fought as their allies. They did pay them for the land. And for about 40 years, it was a time of peace and prosperity. Randomly, Squanto and Samoset came out of the woods to help them. Both of these men had pretty traumatic lives. They had been captured and sold as slaves. They had escaped. Some of them had bought their freedom or been gifted their freedom. And instead of hating the people that did this to them, they were actually moved upon. They were actually convicted that they needed to help them. And they famously taught them how to hunt, how to fish, but also how to survive in the element and how to get along and understand the other natives around them. A lot of historians believe that just these things themselves weren't necessarily coincidental. They believe that these were miracles from God, showing that God was smiling upon the American experience. If you check out Revelation 13, which I'll continually reference, I believe that America was raised up at just the right time, and I think it's miracles like this that made it possible. So if you want to learn more, this is just history in a nutshell. You can check out Michael Medved's The American Miracle. He writes several books, but The American Miracle is available at any public library. Now, that first Thanksgiving was a time of celebration, but it probably wasn't the feasting that we associate with today. Back then, people had just enough to take the edge off. It was about 3 days long. There was about 50 pilgrims because remember the other 50% had died. There was about 90 Wampanoags led by Massasoit, their leader. And this meeting, which lasted 3 days, was a time of eating. It was a time of like sports, a competition, a time of worship, and it just symbolized a temporary peace and cooperation between the two people groups. The pilgrims were devastated because of what had happened to them, but they did not lose their faith in God. You could read their journals, their devotionals, their sermons. They did not dwell upon their hardships, they dwelt upon the goodness of God. And when we look at what they ate at this time, like I said, it wasn't necessarily a time of feasting, which we associate with gluttony. It was a time of just eating with celebration. A lot of the meat was deer, wild fowl, turkey, duck, or geese, fish, clams, lobster, lots of vegetables, particularly beans, squash, and pumpkins. There was not any sugar at that time. Sugar was a very, very scarce food item. And obviously, there would have been like pies or like sweet potatoes with glaze and marshmallows and things like that. Most likely, the fruit would have come from berries, plums, walnuts, or chestnuts. And this 1621 feast was not originally called Thanksgiving. Throughout the years, people would roughly celebrate a time of Thanksgiving in November, but every town or every community would choose their own date. And it really wasn't made into an official holiday until Abraham Lincoln assigned a day to it in 1863 to unite the people during the American Civil War. When we look at all the difficult things that they went through, they will mention some of them in their diaries, but they always put the focus on God and His goodness. Edward Winslow was writing a letter to a friend back in England, and he briefly talked about what they were going through, but at the end he said, although it not always be so plentiful as it were at this time with us, yet by the goodness of God we are so far from want that we often wish you partakers of our plenty. They were very rich in religious freedom. They were really rich in a relationship with God. They were actually experiencing decently good health once they got past that first winter. When you look at people from back then in America, they were about 2 inches taller. They were a few pounds heavier, muscular weight, because of the foods they were eating were in a better quality and a better quantity. They were wealthier. Slavery was not very well widespread in the North. Fairly soon it was eliminated and it was only practiced in the Southern colonies. So life in America was really good, and a lot of it can be attributed to God and what He did through the Pilgrims. As we look back at what God has done for us and what He's done in our nation's history, we don't want to forget that Thanksgiving is a time to just reflect on His goodness. If it wasn't for Revelation 13, for this lamb-like nation arising out of nowhere to provide religious liberty, where would the Protestants have gone? Most of them probably would have been wiped off the face of the earth. Revelation 12 always talks about how the devil, he's at war with the woman and wants to make war with the remnant of her seed. He wants to annihilate any type of remnant that is on this earth. But God protected these pilgrims. He brought them to America. He blew that ship off course 300 to 400 miles so they didn't have to join up with Jamestown. He provided Indians to assist them and to help establish peace relations. He blessed them, even though many of them died and suffered the hardship of a sinful world. He actually blessed their relationship with Him. And next to the writings of Ellen White, the Puritan writings, their sermons, their devotionals, their books, those are what truly have made a difference in my life. They're often under this umbrella called Reformed writings. If you check out Reformed writings, you can go to Banner of Truth, go to their website. I pretty much recommend all those books. These are people that had a very traumatic life, but yet they were always looking for the ways that God had blessed them. So in future weeks, we're actually going to look at how can we have an attitude like them? Because when I look at my life and I look at their life truly is traumatic. I've had some crazy stuff happen to me. I'm technically handicapped. I've had some pretty intense brain surgery where I was supposed to die. My vision went out. I was in the hospital for 2 months. I lost the ability to walk. I mean, things have been difficult in some ways, but when I look back at what they went through, it was like nothing. I had great surgeons, great medical staff, a wonderful spouse, a great job that saved my, employment for me. I mean, there's a lot of good things in my life, and I really can't even compare myself to them who were losing children and spouses. There was times where they couldn't even bury their dead bodies because it was so cold, and they didn't want the Indians to know how many people were dying. And yet, these people are the ones that were spiritually rich. These are the people that I look to. These are the people that I read, that I study, that I use as an example to grow closer to Jesus. So we invite you to join us in future weeks so we can explore their writings more and we can see what made them truly thankful. How could they really genuinely be thankful in the midst of these circumstances? And how can we apply that to our lives today? Because in America right now, we're living a pretty good life. So we should be the most thankful of people. So we appreciate you guys coming out. Thank you for bearing with me. I think it's more interesting when there's the give and take and there's a discussion and cross-referencing. So that will actually occur in future studies. But if you ever want to join us, my email is Ashley, ASHLEY underscore Ingrid, INGRID at yahoo.com. And you are welcome to join us on Monday nights from 6 to 7 on Zoom. If you'll just join me as we close in prayer, that would be wonderful. Dear Lord, thank you for all the goodness that you've given us. Even if we were in jail, even if we were bedridden, even if we were just going through the most horrible of things, you still have given us so many more blessings than we deserve. But the reality is, our lives are probably not like that. Like you've been so good to us, and you've blessed in this time of prosperity. And we have this amazing holiday coming upon us in the next few weeks. Please let us use this time not to just eat and drink and be merry, but to actually engage with you, Lord, to thank you for what you've done, to just grow closer to you, and to just give you the honor and glory that you deserve this Thanksgiving season. Thank you for the way that you've worked in our nation's history. Thank you for the way that you've worked in our lives. And I ask that you just be with us this holiday season. Thank you for loving us. In your precious name, amen.